Hi, my name is Kimberley Duff, and I'm the president of Psi Beta National Honor Society. And I'm so excited today to speak with Alex Zelin, who's going to be talking to us a little bit about her career in industrial organizational psychology. So, welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So, this is great. So, I wonder maybe you could start out just telling us a little bit about your educational background. So, kind of where you started out and how you developed this interest in psychology.
Yeah, so I took psychology in high school and I thought it was kind of interesting. I did have my teacher in high school was a little bit different. And so I wasn't really as in love with psychology as I could have been. Their passion was clearly not there for it. So that translated to us. But when I got to my undergraduate career, I went to a smaller liberal arts college, the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do quite yet. What I did know was that I didn't want to do calculus. Like I was pretty much, I knew that. And so I took sociology my first semester freshman year, and I got so excited. And I called my parents and said, okay, I'm going to major in sociology. And I heard them audibly just over the phone as I said, okay, well, then pick another major to go with it. Okay, I'll go pick another major. Basically, they're trying to tell me pick a useful major. And so then I took psychology as a first year student, and I loved it. And so I called my parents back, and a few months later, I said, okay, I'm going to double major sociology and psychology. And the audible, oh my gosh, my child is never getting a job. And you could tell that they were a little bit worried about that. But what's really cool is that, as you all know, you're taking psychology courses, you're in Psi Beta, is that there's so much that you can do with psychology. And what I have found is that having a background in both, while not necessarily, needed for IO psychology, has actually been really helpful because on the psychology level, you analyze people right at the individual level, but sociology looks at people as a group level. So IO psychology takes us to the workplace, and how do we apply psychology principles, but it's really applied social psychology because the workplace is a whole bunch and it's a big old group of people. But then how do we work for individuals, right? Like how to do individual motivation, but overall, maybe compensation and benefits.
So that's exciting, and that kind of mirrors my path too. I know it's interesting, right? When you tell people you're going to major in psychology, and they say, "What on earth will you do with that?" I think my parents had the same reaction, but you're right. And I think as students and other people watching these series are starting to realize, psychology applies in every area professionally, and so there's so many wonderful things that you can do with a degree in psychology. But IO might be one, or industrial organizational, that students are not as familiar with. Maybe they haven't had a class in IO. At their campus. So can you tell us a little bit about what do you think of when you hear the word industrial organizational psychologist? So if we were to try to explain that to a student, what exactly is the field of industrial organizational psychology?
So that's actually a phenomenal question and something that I had to learn as a graduate student when people said, well, what do you do? When you say industrial organizational psychology, you've lost people before you even got to the organizational part. Or they hear psychology and go, oh, so you're the psychologist I go to at my work. And I'm going, not quite. They're great at what they do, but that's not me. So industrial organizational psychology, I like to call it business psychology. So how do we apply psychology to the workplace to make it better? So then I typically bring up, have you or someone else not liked your job or had a terrible manager? And everyone goes, oh yeah, well, I fixed that, right? Like that's one of the things that I'm trained to do. And so that's how I try to explain what IO psychology is to people who may not necessarily understand what it looks like, um, or really, because industrial organizational is a long word, and to say it fast is a tongue twister in itself. And to be fair, I didn't know it existed until my mom went to a training for her job as a nurse, and she called me and she goes, "You talk a lot. You're engaging. You should be a trainer. I know what you're gonna do. Have you heard of this thing called IO psychology? My boss told me about it." So I was like, all right. So I like took a class and I went, oh, well, this is interesting. Like I see myself doing something like this. Right. Because as much as I really appreciate the clinical and counseling psychology that most people think about when they think about psychology, I knew that that wasn't necessarily for me. because I know that I'm not able to break work from real life. And so I knew I'd be taking home clients' problems. And so I knew that that wasn't necessarily an area, but also bio and cognitive were also not my things. I was much more the social person.
So it's all about finding that good fit, right? And it sounds like you found a good fit for yourself then with your skill set. So what does a typical day look like for you? So what are you doing currently as a professional industrial organizational psychologist? Can you tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about your work?
So right now I am an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga, and I am one of four full-time IO faculty members. So we do have a master's program, which is really awesome. And I enjoy that I get to spend time both in the IO world, but also kind of outside of the IO world and teaching things like social psychology and psychology of women. So as a faculty member, in IO, what I also really like is you're not just pigeonholed into, okay, you're going into academia. A lot of us do consulting work outside of our jobs. So another thing about me is that I'm really indecisive, like really bad indecisive. Of when I finally decided IO, everybody cheered because they went, we all knew it, but I had to make the decision. And one of the best things about it is you can float between a lot of different types of jobs. So when you think about as a faculty member, I'm preparing classes, I'm teaching classes, I'm grading, I'm conducting research, supervising students on research, doing service. But the also really cool part is that I can consult with different organizations and work with them on things that they might need kind of fixed or improved, et cetera. So for instance, one of my specialties is preventing sexual harassment in the workplace and changing organizational culture. So being able to partner with an organization, kind of get a feel for what's going on in the organization, and then what are the next best steps forward to be making these changes. And recognizing that as much as we want change to be immediate, it's kind of a marathon, right? Of what can we do and what are the steps along the way to get to make this organizational change. So I know I answered your question slightly differently, right? Because yes, I'm in academia, but I also want to really, highlight what IO psychologists can do outside of the academia world as well. So you're not just limited to academia with this degree.
Well, and I think that's exciting because it sounds like your day-to-day work changes, right? So sometimes you're on campus as a full-time faculty member and doing your research and doing your teaching, but then you're also going out consulting. So you're applying psychology, right, directly to improving people's lives. And is it mainly like one-on-one consulting? Do you deliver workshops and interventions? What type of things are you doing with these companies?
Yeah, so some of it's one-on-one consulting. Some of it is bringing in students to also help as consultants. Some of it, and what I do for my graduate classes, so I teach personnel selection. So how do you hire the right people for the job? And then performance management, not just the yearly, appraisal, but how do we actually institute good feedback throughout the year? And so when I supervise those classes, I actually partner with local organizations and students will do projects for them. So just recently we partnered, I can't say too much, right, because of non-disclosure, et cetera, but we partnered with one organization who needed a job analysis done in training materials for some training facilitators that we had. There was another organization that needed help with regards to, they kept having high turnover in this one job title. Why were people turning over, and how do we create a kind of selection system so that way when we hire people, we know that they're going to be a good fit? Because part of the issue is people they were hiring are like, what you hired me for isn't what this job looks like. So I definitely have students working out in the world, right, and getting these real hands-on experiences. So a lot of my consulting, half of it is supervising the students, but the other part is maybe giving trainings on performance management. What are the best practices? Again, the sexual harassment, sexual assault prevention, that sort of thing.
So this is really exciting. I think a lot of people are going to be interested. How can they kind of get their foot in the door? So what would your advice be to a student if they're watching this talk and they're saying, wow, this sounds really cool. I didn't know this was a job that I could do for a living and get paid. What would you suggest to a student that they should be looking at right now while they're an undergraduate?
Yeah, so one of the things to know is that not every school offers IO as a class. So when I took IO Psych in undergrad, it was mostly a business class cross-listed with psychology. So not many people in my program took it. Not many people even went into grad school. About half of my cohort hadn't taken IO psychology because it just wasn't offered. So I want you to know that that's not a limiting factor. You don't have to take the class if you would like to kind of move on in the degree. So that's, first and foremost, but number two, that also applies to research. So the research that I did in undergrad was, one in sociology was, what does family life look like on television? So what were women's roles on television, which, spoiler, they don't work. And then for my senior thesis, it was about sex in the first year women population. So it wasn't even anything related to IO psychology. So if I don't want people to be super worried that just because there's no IO class, or there's no one who really knows IO at your university, that you're down and out for the count, because you definitely aren't, right? You still want to say, here's why I would be good if you're looking at graduate school. Here's why I would be really great for this area, right? I've prepared myself for graduate school doing this. And here's why my interests lie in this over here. What is also really important to consider is a lot of people say, in a lot of other fields of psychology, is you have to get a PhD. And in IO, that's simply not the case. So what's really awesome is that there are a ton of great master's programs out there. I'll plug mine, it's great. But then also PhD programs. And the real difference is, if you love research and you love statistics, then you would go for the PhD program. Or if you really want to teach, right? You want to be in academia, that's your goal. But otherwise, that's really the only difference between a master's and a PhD program. While a PhD might get you a little bit higher pay once you graduate, they've actually found it evens out. And there are tons of job opportunities available for people who have master's degrees in IO psychology. And with the pandemic hitting and everything going online, they're especially needing people who are specializing in the whole work from home aspect. Because a lot of companies are now going to go remote. So how does that work for hiring? How does that work for performance management? How does that work for employee well-being, employee well-being is a huge part of IO psychology. And so, thinking about IO psychologists are really going to be needed because our entire working world has changed because of the pandemic. And what's that going to mean? And how do we keep people engaged when everybody's through Zoom, right? And you might have Zoom burnout at some point, or, the work-life balance, where we're seeing a lot of research articles coming out where the women have now been the ones responsible for the kids and the kids schooling at home. And a lot of women have actually left the workforce simply because, well, now they're taking care of the kids, because it's assumed in a heteronormative relationship that the woman's going to take care of the kids and the man gets to go to work. And so that's also brought up a lot of talk within IO psychology as well.
So that's good to know, because I think that's a question a lot of people always have, is what are the job prospects, right, into the future? And especially, yes, when we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, that's good to hear that it sounds like there would be a lot of job opportunities for consulting, but also certainly a lot of opportunities for people to do research in this field, and kind of evolving, right, with how the world is evolving, like you talked about, from working from home and working digitally and over video conferencing. That opens up a whole arena where maybe IO psychologists haven't studied that as much before. So, and I really I appreciate too, and I think students will appreciate you talking about the different degrees, because that's a question that people have often is, wow, this kind of career in psychology sounds really exciting. How much training do I need? What kind of degrees do I have to obtain? So this has been really valuable, Alex. Is there any kind of parting advice that you would have for students, or anything else that you would like to share that you love about what you do as an IO psychologist?
Yeah. So one thing that I will share to consider is checking out Division 14 of the American Psychological Association. That is the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychologists. So you can kind of read a little bit more about who we are, what we do, that sort of thing. But one of the things that I love, especially about IO psychology, is, again, I didn't have to make a decision to be pigeonholed into one area. And if you want to make that decision, you definitely can. If you're like, performance management, that's the way I'm going, and that's your main focus, that's awesome. But I love that I have the ability. So I do a lot of work, again, with sexual harassment, gender, but I bring that kind of aspect in. And so what we love about IO is that because it's one of the newer, quote unquote, newer fields of psychology, is that the way to grow it is to bring in other ideas from other aspects of psychology. So for instance, I'm working with a colleague who is a cognitive psychologist, and we use an eye tracker machine to determine where are people looking when they read resumes, and does that differ based upon the perceived gender of the name that's on the resume.
Mm.
So like, who would have thought cognitive psychology would have ever, right, gone into IO psychology? So what I really love is that you can pull in things from all sorts of other disciplines and areas of psychology. So it's not just you pick this and this is it, you can't do anything else, but it is the way to expand the field. And you get to still use and implement a lot of your interests.
Well, great. I look forward to reading that article. That sounds really interesting. I've had friends that have used eye trackers, but yeah, mainly for looking at like reading speed and processing of reading text. So that sounds really exciting and really valuable and pertinent to today's time. So I would like to thank you so much, Alex, for taking the time to meet with us today. And thank you for all your insight and inspiration into industrial organizational psychology.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I'm happy to be open for questions if you all would like to send me an email.
Great. Thank you.